He looked at her over the threshold of his ranch house as if she were something the wind had blown in and ought to be swept back out, and told her plainly there was no work and no charity for strangers at Vane's Crossing. Susanna Marlowe stood on Garrett Vane's porch with her stomach hollow as a dry well and her boots worn through at the toe, and she did not beg, though begging had been exactly what she'd come to do. She had walked 6 miles from the ruin of her father's homestead with nothing left but the clothes on her back and a locket that had been her mother's, and she had heard in town that the rancher at Vane's Crossing sometimes hired hands for the winter cutting, sometimes fed a hungry traveller at his own table without asking too many questions. She had heard wrong, it seemed, or she had simply come on the one day a hard man's patience for strangers had run dry. "I can work," she said. "Kitchen, laundry, anything. I don't need pay, Mr. Vane, only a meal and a place to sleep dry tonight." "I've got hands enough," Garrett said, and his eyes went over her the way a man's eyes go over a stray dog he suspects of carrying something contagious, not cruel, exactly, but closed, bolted shut against whatever claim she might try to make on him. "Try the church in Cold Fork. They keep a box for folks in your situation." "I've been to the church," she said. "The box was empty a week ago, same as my larder." "Then I'm sorry for it," he said, in a voice that did not sound sorry at all, only tired, and worn thin by something that had nothing to do with her. "But I can't take in every wanderer that finds their way to my door. A man learns that the hard way, or he loses everything he's built to folks who talk sweet and take advantage." He shut the door. Not hard, not with malice she could point to and call cruelty outright, just firm, final, the quiet closing of a man who had decided the conversation was finished before it had properly begun. Susanna stood on the porch a moment longer, the cold coming up through the soles of her boots. And then she turned and walked back down the frozen road toward Cold Fork with her chin up and her eyes dry, because crying would not fill her belly and would not warm her feet, and she had long since learned which griefs were worth the spending of tears and which were better carried in silence. She did not hate him for it, not even then. She only understood, with the flat clarity of the truly desperate, that she would have to save herself, because no one else was coming to do it for her. It had not always been this way. 2 years back she'd had a father, a homestead, and a future that looked, if not grand, at least steady. A small house with good glass windows he'd freighted in special, 40 acres of decent corn ground, and a name in the county that meant something. Then the influenza took him in a single hard week, and the back taxes he'd never told her about came due all at once, and the bank in Cold Fork had nailed a notice to her own front door with the same brisk indifference Garrett Vane had shown her on his porch. She had learned in the space of that single terrible month precisely how quickly the ground a person stood on could open up beneath them, and precisely how few hands reached out to catch a falling woman once her name no longer had land attached to it. It was old Mrs. Odell who took her in that night, a widow herself who kept a boarding house on the edge of Cold Fork and who had buried enough of her own hopes to recognize desperation when it came knocking. Mrs. Odell had no money to spare either, but she had a spare room and a soft heart, and she put Susanna to work scrubbing floors and mending linens in trade for a bed and 2 meals a day, which was more mercy than Susanna had found anywhere else in a month of asking. Garrett Vane wasn't always so hard, Mrs. Dell told her one evening, over mending in the boarding-house parlor. He lost his young wife 3 winters back, and a fortune to a smooth-talking land agent the year after, a man who took his trust and half his herd money and vanished east before anyone could stop him. Garrett's not cruel by nature, child. He's just been burned so many times he can't tell tinder from a friendly fire anymore. Susanna turned that over, but found it did not much soften the memory of the door closing in her face. A man's grief did not put bread in her mouth, and she had troubles enough of her own without carrying the weight of his. Her father's homestead was gone to the bank, sold out from under her for back taxes she hadn't known existed until the notice came nailed to the door. She had no kin left within 500 miles. She had, in the whole world, a locket, a boarding room she paid for in scrub work, and a growing callous over the place in her heart where hope used to sit soft and hopeful. She built a life in Cold Fork anyway, the way people do when there is nothing else to be done but keep moving forward. She took in sewing from the ladies of the town, careful, even stitches that soon had 3 families asking for her by name. She learned the roads and the river paths from delivering mended clothes to outlying farms, learned which crossings held ice thick enough to trust and which did not, learned to read the sky the way her father had taught her. Back when he was alive and the homestead was still theirs, and she had not yet understood how quickly a whole life could come apart at the seams. Not everyone in Cold Fork turned a cold shoulder. Ellery Cade, Garrett's foreman, took to leaving a sack of split kindling on Mrs. Odell's back step some mornings, never remarking on it, never asking thanks, the way a decent man does a kindness he doesn't want acknowledged. When Susanna asked him plainly why he bothered, he only shrugged and said a woman walking 6 miles on an empty stomach deserved better than what she'd gotten at his boss's door, and that he figured somebody in this county ought to prove Garrett Vane wasn't the whole of what Vane's Crossing had to offer. It was a small thing, a sack of kindling, but it kept a fire burning through the coldest nights of that month, and she did not forget it. She saw Garrett Vane twice more that month, both times from a distance, once at the Mercantile, buying nails and rope with the same clothes, tired face he'd worn on his porch, and once riding the river road toward his own land with his collar up against the wind. Neither time did he see her, or if he did, he gave no sign of remembering the woman he'd turned away hungry. She told herself she did not mind. Mostly she found this was even true. The gossip in Cold Fork did not spare her the way Garrett's memory apparently had. There were women in town, Delphine Ashcroft foremost among them, who had decided within a week of Susanna's arrival that a homeless woman taken in by charity was a woman with something to hide, and who said as much loudly whenever Susanna came within earshot at the Mercantile or the church social. Susanna bore it the way she bore most things now, with her spine straight and her eyes forward, because she had learned that the surest way to survive small cruelties was to refuse them the satisfaction of a flinch. The hardest of it came 3 weeks in, when the same Cold Fork bank that had taken her father's homestead sent a notice to Mrs. Odell's boarding house as well, citing a back assessment on the property that Mrs. Odell swore she'd paid the previous fall. So Susanna sat with the old woman at her kitchen table long past midnight, going over the boarding house ledgers by lamplight with the same careful eye she'd once turned on her father's accounts and found, buried in a column of careless bank arithmetic, an error of nearly $40 charged twice against the widow's name. "You can't fight a bank, child," Mrs. Odell said, wringing her hands. "Not a woman alone, and not you neither, not with nothing behind your name but a needle and a prayer. I can fight a mistake," Susanna said. "Same as I'd fight any lie, bank or otherwise." She wrote out the discrepancy in a clean, careful hand the next morning, walked it into the bank herself, and stood at the teller's window with her spine straight until a clerk agreed, grudgingly, to check the ledger against her figures. And found her right. Cost her an afternoon and a fair measure of the courage she had left to spend, but it saved Mrs. Odell's roof, and it taught Susanna something she had not fully believed until she'd proven it herself, that she was not, in fact, powerless. Whatever a closed door or an empty larder might have convinced her of a month before, it was a small victory, but she carried it with her after, folded away like a coin kept for hard times, and she found she needed it sooner than she expected. It was a hard month, but not an idle one, and by its end Susanna had begun, cautiously, to believe she might actually make a life here, a small one, a plain one, but hers, built with her own 2 hands out of nothing but stubbornness and a needle and thread. She was crossing the river road on the last Tuesday of that month, a bundle of mended shirts under her arm bound for the Kettleman farm on the far bank, when she heard the shout. It came from downriver, where at Gainslands ran along the water a man's voice, raw with a fear that carried clear across the frozen flats, and beneath it a sound Susanna's body understood before her mind caught up to it, the deep, groaning crack of river ice giving way. She dropped the bundle and ran. She came up over the low rise above the crossing to see a scene that stopped her heart cold in her chest. Garrett Vane, chest deep in black water where the ice had opened beneath him, one arm hooked over a broken shelf of ice that was already crumbling at the edges. His face gone white with a cold that would kill him in minutes if it didn't drone him first. His horse stood riderless and skittish on the bank, and there was no one else in sight, no hand. No neighbor, nothing between Garrett Vane and the river swallowing him whole, but Susanna Marlowe, standing alone on the rise with her heart hammering and her mind, suddenly and fiercely very clear. She had grown up on a river. She knew in the marrow of her exactly what killed a man in water like that, and exactly what it took to keep him alive long enough to matter. "Don't fight the current," she shouted, already scrambling down the bank, casting her eyes over the ground for anything long enough to reach him. A fallen branch, a fence rail, anything. "Hold to the ice and keep your face up. I'm coming." "Get back," Garrett gasped, his voice already slurred with the cold. "Ice won't hold you either. Get help." "There's no time for help." Susanna called back and found what she needed. A fence rail half buried in the frozen mud at the river's edge, long enough to bridge the gap between solid ground and the crumbling shelf where he clung. She dragged it free, testing her own weight against the bank ice before she committed to it, because she had learned the hard way that a rescuer who drowned alongside the man she meant to save was no rescue at all. "I'm going to lay this rail out to you. When it reaches, you take hold with both hands and I'll pull. Don't let go of the ice till the rail's under your arms. You hear me, Garrett Vane?" He heard her. Something in his grey, failing face changed at the sound of his own in her voice, recognition dawning slow through the cold. But there was no time now for either of them to remark on the strangeness of it. The woman he'd turned from his door a month back, now the only soul standing between him and the river's bottom. She laid the rail flat across the ice, testing each foot of her advance before trusting her weight to it, moving slow and sure the way her father had taught her on the river behind their old homestead, back when she was a girl, and the worst thing she'd ever had to fear was a soaking. The ice groaned beneath her but held. She reached the broken edge and thrust the rail out toward him, close enough at last for his numbed hands to close around it. "Both hands," she said. "Now kick with everything you've got left, Garrett. I can't pull what you won't help me lift." He kicked. She pulled, bracing her whole weight backward along the rail, her boots skidding on the ice, her arms screaming with a strain she would feel for a week after. Halfway through the pull, the ice beneath her own feet let out a groan like a dying animal and split along a fresh seam, and for one heart-stopping instant she was certain they would both go under together, the rail useless between them, the river closing over two lives instead of sparing one. She threw her weight backward anyway, refusing the fear room enough to slow her, digging her heels into a stretch of thicker ice a foot behind her, and between his last dredged-up strength and her own refusal to let the rail slip, he came up out of the black water in a heaving, gasping rush that broke the ice shelf entirely behind him. A half-second later, she understood, and the whole platform would have gone under with him on it, and likely her with it. She got him onto solid ground and did not stop to let either of them catch breath. She had seen cold like this take men before, back on the river with her father, seen how it crept in quiet after the crisis looked past, how a man could survive the water only to die an hour later of the cold itself, slow and unremarked. She stripped his sodden coat from with hands that shook, wrapped him instead in her own shawl and every dry thing she could strip from her own person without shaming either of them, and half-dragged, half-walked him the quarter-mile to the nearest shelter, a line shack of his own, she realized, once she got the door open, meant for exactly this kind of emergency, stocked with a wood stove and a cot and mercifully dry blankets in a cedar chest. "Get the fire," she said, guiding him down onto the cot, her voice steadier now that there was work to be done, because had always been the thing that steadied her. "I need you talking to me, Garrett. Tell me anything. Tell me your mother's name. Tell me the price of cattle. I don't care what, just keep talking while I get this stove lit." "Why?" he managed through chattering teeth. "Why are you—" "Talk," she said. "Not now. Later, when you're not shaking so hard your teeth might crack." Talked anyway in halting bursts, once the worst of the shivering had eased enough to let him. He'd gone out after a heifer that had wandered onto the river ice chasing some scrap of green beneath the snow, he said. A foolish animal not worth a man's life, but he hadn't been able to leave her bawling out there with the ice groaning under her hooves, not with calving season coming and the herd already thin from a hard year. He'd gotten a rope on her and turned to lead her back when the ice gave way beneath his own boots instead of hers, and the heifer, spooked, had bolted clear to solid ground without him. "Fool thing to risk a life over a heifer," he said. "I know it." "No," Susanna said, feeding another log into the stove. "It's the same fool thing I'd have done myself. A creature depending on you doesn't stop needing you just because the risk got larger than you planned for. I understand that better than most. She got the stove roaring within minutes, her hands moving with the sure economy of a woman who had built fires in worse conditions than this her whole hard life, and then she peeled the last of his wet things away with brisk, businesslike care, tucking blanket after blanket around him with the practical modesty of a nurse rather than the awkwardness of a stranger, because there was no room now for anything but keeping a man's heart beating. She pressed her own bare hands to his, rubbing warmth back into fingers gone the color of ash. And when the shivering did not ease fast enough to satisfy her, she climbed onto the narrow cot beside him, blankets and all, and held him against her own warmth the way she would have held anyone dying of cold. Because that was what the cold demanded, and she had never yet let modesty kill a man she could save. "You turned me away a month back," she said quietly, into the dark of the line shack, while the stove ticked and settled and his shivering began slowly to ease. "Told me you had no charity for strangers." "I remember," Garrett said, his voice thin but steadier now. "I've thought on it since. More than I'd like to admit. Why'd you do it?" He was quiet a long moment, staring up at the low rafters, and when he spoke again his voice had a rawness in it that had nothing to do with the cold. "My wife died 3 winters back. Fever, sudden, gone before the doctor even reached her. Then the next year a man I trusted with half my savings smiled at me for a month and rode off with everything I hadn't nailed down. I stopped believing somewhere in there that anybody who came asking for help was asking for anything honest. Easier to shut the door than to be made a fool of again." "So you shut it on me," Susanna said. "A starving woman with nothing to gain from lying to you." "I know it," he said. "I knew it the moment the door closed, if I'm honest. I've regretted it near every day since. I asked after you in town twice and never had the courage to come find you and say so." Well, Susanna said and found, despite everything, that there was no bitterness left in her to spend on it, only a tired, aching relief that he was breathing and warming and alive beneath her hands. "You've found me now. Or I've found you more rightly, seeing as you were halfway to the bottom of that river." A ghost of a laugh moved through him, weak but real. "I owe you my life, Miss Marlowe." "You owe me nothing," she said. "I didn't pull you out to collect a debt." "Then why?" She considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. "Because nobody came to my door. That month I was starving, and I understood something out there on the ice just now that I hadn't let myself understand before. That the world doesn't get any kinder by 2 people refusing kindness back and forth at each other forever. Somebody has to be the one who doesn't slam the door. I decided a while back it might as well be me." Garrett was quiet after that, and Susanna thought perhaps he drifted toward sleep, exhaustion finally winning out over the fear. But after a while his hand found hers beneath the blankets, cold still but steadying by the minute, and he held it the way a man holds something he has only just understood the worth of. They stayed in the line shack through the worst of the night, Susanna dozing only in snatches, waking every hour to check the fire and the color of his face and the steadiness of his breath, until the grey hour before dawn when Hutch, no, not Hutch, this was Garrett's own foreman, a broad, worried, maimed Ellery Cade, found them by the trail of Susanna's dropped mending and the smoke rising from the line shack chimney, and came pounding on the door half frantic with relief to find his employer alive and breathing. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Cold Fork. By noon the following day, half the county knew that the woman Garrett Vane had turned from his door a month back had pulled him bodily from the freezing river and nursed him through the night in a line shack, alone, with no chaperone and no witness but the fire and the falling snow. Not every version of the story that traveled was kind. Delphine Ashcroft, who had spent a month already whispering about Susanna's character, found in the tale a fresh and juicier thread to pull, and by the second day she was declaring at the mercantile, loud enough for half the store to hear, that no decent woman spent a night alone with an unmarried man, hero or not, and that Susanna Marlowe's sudden appearance at the scene of Garrett Vane's accident struck her as considerably too convenient to be entirely innocent. The talk cost Susanna 2 of her 3 sewing families within a week. Mothers suddenly uneasy about a woman of such loose reputation handling their daughters' Sunday dresses, and it was Mrs. Odell who came to her, grey-faced, to say the preacher himself had asked after the particulars, wondering aloud whether a word from the pulpit on propriety might be in order. Susanna did not weep over it, though she wanted to. She had built this small life herself, stitch by stitch, out of nothing, and she understood with a bitter clarity how easily a town could take a woman's whole reputation and unravel it in a week over nothing but a story told cruelly enough times. She thought, more than once in those days, of simply enduring it in silence, as she had endured Delphine's whispers before. But she found, this time, that the ground beneath her felt too hard-won to surrender without a fight. Garrett came to the boarding house himself 3 days later, still moving stiff from the cold that had nearly claimed him, with a small paper-wrapped parcel in his hands and something in his face that Susanna had not seen there before, not the closed, tired worriness of the man on the porch, but something open and a little afraid. In the particular way of a man unused to asking for anything. "I came to apologize proper," he said, standing in Mrs. Odell's front parlor with his hat in his hands. "Not for the river. You know already what you did there, and I haven't the words to thank you rightly for it. I came to apologize for the door, for turning away a starving woman because I'd let 2 hard losses convince me that kindness always comes with a bill attached. You didn't deserve that. Nobody would have." "No," Susanna agreed, "I didn't. But I understand it better now than I did that day, hearing what put the lock on your door in the first place. That's more grace than I earned," he said. "I heard, too, what Delphine Ashcroft's been saying about the night in the line shack. Ellery told me the whole of it, the sewing family's backing away, the preacher asking after your character. I want you to know I went to see him myself yesterday, and to the mercantile after, and I told them plainly what happened on that ice and in that shack, in front of near a dozen witnesses. I told them if any soul in this town has a word to say against the woman who saved my life at risk of her own, they can say it to my face, because I intend to make my regard for you known publicly enough that no wagging tongue in Cold Fork will dare repeat it twice." Susanna felt something in her chest loosen that had been wound tight for 3 days. "You didn't have to do that," Garrett said. "A door closed on you once already because of my own fear. I won't stand by and let this town close another." Probably, she agreed, and something in her own chest, some lost cold and guarded corner, eased at the small startled laugh that pulled out of him at her bluntness. "But I've found grace is worth more given than withheld, Mr. Vane. I decided that on the ice, pulling you out. I don't intend to unlearn it now for the sake of pride." He held out the parcel. Inside, when she opened it, was a bolt of good wool cloth, fine enough for a winter coat, and beneath it, folded small, the deed to a modest parcel of land bordering his own, the old Hollister place she recognized, gone fallow since its last owner passed, with a sound cabin and a well that never ran dry even in the driest summers. "I can't accept land from you," she said, startled, turning the deed over in her hands as though it might vanish if she looked at it too long. It was the Hollister place exactly as she remembered it from childhood visits with her father. Good stone chimney, a well that never failed, an orchard gone wild but not beyond saving. "Land isn't a thank you note, Garrett. It's a life. You can't hand a woman a life over one favor, however large." "It isn't payment," Garrett said, holding her gaze steady the way he had on the ice, as if he understood that a woman who had lost one home to a stranger's carelessness would need more than pretty words to trust a second one. "It's an offer of work, if you'll have it. The town needs a seamstress with her own shop and her own roof, not a boarder mending shirts for a supper. I've got the money to see it done, and God knows I owe you a debt no bolt of cloth will settle. Take it as what it is. A start. Nothing more unless you'd want it to be." "And if I wanted it to be more?" Susanna asked, because she found, standing there with wool cloth in her arms and a deed in her hand and a man before her who had finally fully opened his door, that she did want it with a certainty that surprised her, given how the month had begun. "Then I'd be the luckiest fool in Cold Fork," Garrett said, "seeing as I already turned away my own good fortune once, and don't intend to be given the chance to do it twice." She married him the following spring, in the small stone church at Cold Fork, with Mrs. Odell weeping happily in the front pew, Ellery Cade standing up as Garrett's witness with a grin he could not seem to wipe off his face all afternoon, and even Delphine Ashcroft, humbled and considerably quieter these days, offering her grudging good wishes at the door. Susanna kept her seamstress shop on the old Hollister land even after the wedding, because it was hers, built with her own hands out of nothing, and Garrett never once suggested she give it up, understanding, better than most men might have, exactly what it meant to a woman to have something in this world that could not be taken from her by a bank notice, or a hard winter, or anyone else's cruelty. She hired on 2 of the sewing families back within the year, and a handful more besides. And it was Ellery Cade himself who fixed the sign above her shop door the week of the wedding, hand-lettered and a little crooked, reading simply Marloweus, for she kept her own name over the door, even after she took Garrett's at the altar. A small stubbornness he understood without needing it explained. Mrs. Odell's boarding house never again saw a wrongful notice nailed to its door, either. Garrett quietly settled an account with the bank the same week he settled his heart, though he never spoke of it. And Susanna only learned of it years later, from Mrs. Odell herself, weeping again, this time from gratitude rather than fear. On the anniversary of the day she'd pulled him from the ice, they walked the river road together every year after, past the crossing where the current still ran fast and black in the cold months, and Garrett would take her hand the way he had that first night in the line shack, steady now, sure, a man who had learned at last that the door worth keeping open was the one guarding his own heart. "You saved my life on this river," he told her every year, the same words, because some truths were worth repeating until they wore smooth and warm as a well-loved stone. "But you saved the rest of me the night you decided to forgive the man who nearly let you starve. That's the debt I'll spend the whole of my life trying to repay." And every year Susanna would answer him the same way, because it was, after everything, simply true. "You don't owe me a debt, Garrett Vane. You only ever owed me the door, and you've kept it open every day since."